Hello everyone, and welcome back to another devlog on my airborne farming simulator. Last time I implemented the shop, which was a significant step towards finishing my game. However, it left me in an interesting position. What exactly should I work on next? For the longest time I've just been adding any new objects and mechanics that I found interesting, but I'm getting to the point where I actually want to start thinking about finishing and releasing my game. Just adding new stuff isn't a sufficient plan for achieving that. So, I decided on a new plan. Determine exactly what I need to do to reach the minimum level of quality where it would be acceptable to release, and aim for that. Of course, I wouldn't actually release it in that state, but I'll be left with essentially the most basic form of the game, meaning that anything else I added would only be there to make it even better. The thing is, I don't actually know how much content I want to add to the game, as it depends on plenty of things, like how much time I have to work on it, and how much people actually like the game and want to see more from it. So the benefit of this plan is that all I have to do is achieve that base form, and then I can add as much else as I want and still have a good product. The only issue is that up until now I've implemented a lot of features in ways that are quick to set up, but not necessarily maintainable, extensible, or high quality, which means that if I actually wanted to make progress on finishing my game, I'd first have to do a lot of refactoring and refining, which isn't exactly the most exciting prospect, especially refactoring. But it had to be done, so as a determined game developer I got to work. I started by updating a lot of the worst code. The most egregious example is probably with usable objects like the compressor and shredder. I hadn't yet implemented a way for the player to generically interact with things, so all of their behavior code was stored in the player. This obviously had to be fixed, so I designed a way for usable objects to hold their own behaviors that are only triggered by the player. I made a countless number of other changes in a similar vein, like tweaking certain algorithm implementations or adding variables and functions for frequently used data and behaviors. But apparently this process was so mundane that I honestly can't remember much else. I spent a good amount of time on this sort of work, yet in my mind it all just blends together. Afterwards I felt very demoralized, as despite all the work I'd put in, all I had to show for it was a bit of organized code, and I still had everything else to do. But once again, the only way I was going to make progress was by getting to work. So after a short break, I created the to-do list of every change necessary to achieve the base version of the game. Over time, this list would grow or shrink as I thought of things that were essential or determined that other things actually weren't. But as I worked through them, the list would gradually get smaller and smaller as I neared my goal. One of the first tasks I tackled was overhauling the background. I always just imagined that it showed the sky and never really thought about it deeper than that. But with my newfound attention, I realized that, well, if the camera is pointing downwards, you wouldn't actually be looking up at the sky, but rather down at the ground. In the lore, these islands are above water, so I had to make a water sprite. It wasn't too difficult, though I spent a lot of time picking the right colors that give the sort of atmosphere I'm going for. I also updated the clouds, mainly by drawing a new sprite, which I think looks much better than the old ones, but also by finally adding a proper parallax effect. I expected these changes to look better, but what I didn't expect is that combined they give the environment a much better sense of place. It's kind of hard to describe, but I feel like I have a much easier time picturing how this new version fits in the world, if that makes sense. I also decided to draw a new sprite for the house, which I think turned out great. Honestly, it's probably my favorite sprite I've made for the game so far. Afterwards, I wanted to adjust a lot of UI elements which sort of left a bad taste in my mouth. I started with the HUD, and I know I seemingly can't go a single devlog without mentioning the thing, but I won't spend too long on it. Outside of some small tweaks, the main thing that bothered me was the positioning of the inventory. It stuck out to the right further than the money, yet it's further down, producing an unbalanced look. I couldn't swap them, since the inventory might be empty, and I couldn't just make the money counter really long, since certain items might have long names as well. So I settled on the best compromise I could think of, which was to put the inventory to the right of the money, which at the cost of losing 2 slots, I think looks much nicer. The other bit of UI I changed was the text boxes. For the standard text boxes, they now support multiple pages, a typewriter effect, and the option to add a speaker name. Oh, and the arrow is in the middle rather than the corner. For the value picker text boxes, which were completely broken before, they're now actually functional, and the value appears on the top right, out of the way of the text. I even made a variation for selecting options from a list. Speaking of text, I also took the time to update the font, mainly to improve some of the characters' proportions, though I also added an infinity symbol for the shop, and I changed the currency symbol from $1 to something completely unique, based on the symbol of the sun, actually. The main difficulty I had while working on the HUD was settling on small details. That's something I've had to deal with a lot generally, but especially here. It's easy to say in theory how a text box should look, but it's something else to decide exactly how it should be shaped and colored, and exactly where each arrow or selection should go. Somewhat related to the UI, I finally added an intro cutscene. Nothing's shown, and all of the text is placeholder, but all of the functionality is here for when I do settle on some story details. Specifically for the intro, I also created a unique banner pop-up to show the context, and a special function that executes some code after waiting a certain amount of time. On the topic of miscellaneous changes, I also finally gave the wind the ability to change direction. Its behavior is quite basic, simply adding a random angle each frame, though I'd like to make it more complex sometime in the future. Another minor change is the new alert system. Previously, you had no way of knowing if you could actually interact with something. But thanks to the changes I made in the refactoring phase, it was trivially easy to check if there's a usable object nearby and pop an exclamation point up to show that you can interact with it. My favorite detail is how it flashes from orange to yellow. I also worked on plenty of other small features that aren't as significant. The final major feature I implemented was easily the one I was dreading the most, and that's the enhanced object placing. In previous versions, you could literally place objects anywhere you wanted, even if that's in midair or directly on top of another object. When you placed an object down, it was also physically impossible to remove, which you could say is a bit of an issue. Additionally, I wanted to add a preview that shows where your object is going to be placed while you're holding it. The first major problem I had to deal with involved associating specific items from the inventory with sprites for the preview and objects for placing. I was considering making these properties intrinsic to the items, but since not every item has them, and this functionality is seemingly exclusive to the player, I decided to give the player that responsibility, though I might choose to change that in the future. The other major problem was figuring out if a placement was valid. My solution to this is to check if the tile is above grass and doesn't collide with a solid object. However, there are also other objects like the player that aren't solid but shouldn't have objects placed on them, so I added special checks for those as well. Once I had those two things sorted, everything else fell into place nicely, though it was definitely a piece of work. A neat quality of life feature I also added is that you can arm and unarm your item. So if you don't want to see the preview, but you don't want to switch to a different item, you can simply unarm it. After finishing the new object placing system, I realized that there weren't actually many major issues left to solve. Sure, there's still a lot of minor things, and a good number of missing elements, but as far as the actual standard gameplay goes, it all seems to be completely functional. In the beginning, I was under the impression that fixing it would take much longer, so I was pleasantly surprised to see how quickly I started making progress. By the end, I was definitely a lot less demoralized. Anyway, at the moment, I estimate that I'm over 80% of the way towards completing that base version, but it might be a bit more or less depending on which features count as basic. The best part though, is that I now have a much better foundation to work with, meaning that as I continue working on the game, it should be significantly easier to implement those final features and improvements. Thanks for watching, bye.